Sketchy Stories. Back in 2004, my husband and I were given 3 of our grandchildren to raise. They were boys aged from 1.5 to 3 and 4.5 years old. The boys were followed a few months later by their sister, a newborn, who was also given to us to raise. We lived in a small town in New England, so small you could step outside of the house and see the police station, fire department, and post office just beyond the house. When I was young, we had stop signs downtown, where there are stoplights now. My grandmother and father were born there, and I lived for 6 decades in that town. It was the kind of place where if you needed some vegetables for supper, you went to a neighbor's house who had a garden, took what you needed, and left the money on their front porch. We lived on the main street, but were surrounded by many forested acres. 3 rivers run through the town, and we had a large field behind our house. There were many fields throughout the towns. There were also farms in the area and in the neighboring towns as well. They were very New England type towns. Small, comfy, everybody knows everybody. So when the children first came to live with us, both my husband and I worked. He worked at a transit company in a local city, and I worked as a paralegal. My job was a 4-hour commute, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. I would be gone from the house for 12 hours out of the day at a minimum. I often worked on weekends too. My husband took a leave of absence from his job and stayed at home with the children for 2.5 years. When he returned to work, he would work the night shift. That enabled him to watch the children during the day. He did his best with the children while I was at work, and given the circumstances, he did a great job. One day after work, when the youngest children were 6 and 4 respectively, I came home to find the house in a state of disarray. Supper hadn't been made, and the kids were running to me with quite a story about a big gorilla. A big gorilla that had been outside that day. The 2 youngest let me know that during the afternoon they saw a big gorilla in front of the house running along the street. They said it was very fast. Then the big gorilla jumped our picket fence and ran into our yard. The children said they had their noses pressed against the window pane, and that the big gorilla came up to the window and growled at them, and then pushed its paws against the window. The children said they tried to wake up my husband, but he had fallen asleep on the couch and they could not rouse him. The big gorilla ran into the backyard, where it broke some of our car windows and threw about some trash cans. I didn't believe the children. I was too exhausted to deal with it, and responded with my "that's nice" comment that I used for anything I couldn't handle at the moment. I do recall reading in the newspaper a few days later that the police were warning folks about vehicle damage, but I never gave any further thought. I didn't give it any further thought, even though a few years prior to the big gorilla incident, I had seen a very large dead wolf that I presumed had been hit by a car laying on the roadside. It was not a coyote, nor was it a coyote dog. I had seen pictures of wolves, and this was one immense, huge wolf. I had personally seen coyote dogs while riding my horse along the trails. The wolf body was gone the next day, and no mention by authorities of any wolf sighting was in the newspapers. I thought that was sort of unusual. Did we have wolves in our area? Wouldn't that be newsworthy? Did anyone else see this wolf? Obviously someone had, as its body was gone the following day. I also did not give the big gorilla story much further thought, even though years before the children came, both my husband and I witnessed large dog-type footprints in our backyard. We mentioned those prints to our friends, the animal control officer in a nearby town, who didn't seem too surprised by our finds. However, we never discussed that again. I didn't give the big gorilla story much thought either, even though at about the time we saw the dog prints in our backyard, our cats had started to go missing. I found one of our cats, Peter, the best hunter in town, high up on my neighbor's roof. The house was 3 stories, with the first floor and second floor occupied by tenants, and the third an attic. Lots of those older homes in New England always had full attics. I called Peter, managed to enter the building, and climbed to the second floor with a clothes basket. I climbed onto the porch railing, put the basket above my head, and up to the house gutters. And Peter dropped in. Thankfully, we managed to save our wonderful cat. Even one of our friends asked why Peter was up on the roof. Peter was not scared of anything, but I was still not connecting the dots. When the children got a little older, we moved to North Carolina. It was in North Carolina, when the children were in their teen years, that I started finding research on the dog man. While listening to stories on YouTube, I connected the dots. Wait a minute, I thought. Didn't they say big gorilla and something very fast? When the children told me this story, did the children have an encounter with something all those years back? I immediately spoke with our 12-year-old and 14-year-old separately. Do you remember that time you told me the story about the big gorilla? The 12-year-old energetically told me every single thing she remembered. The animal was very large, very fast. It had black hair and long bushy tail. It growled. It had paws with fingers. It stood up and pushed on the window with those paws. It ran very fast and jumped over the fence, and it had ran into the backyard and made a lot of noise breaking things. The 12-year-old said it did not have the face of a gorilla or monkey, but she couldn't tell me more about the face because of the hair. The 14-year-old shivered when I asked if he remembered it. He said he would never forget that thing coming into the yard. He remembers it clearly as if it was yesterday. He too remembers the swiftness of the creature, the black hair on it, how it had jumped the fence and was running amok from the front to the backyard. He said he doesn't know what that thing was and doesn't think he ever will, but that he hopes he never has to see it again. The children now know about the dogmen, BigFoot, and other cryptids. We're aware that dogmen don't always stay in the forest. They're often seen among neighborhoods, and perhaps, just perhaps, the creature that my children saw all those years ago was just that, a dogman in a small New England town. Anonymous, summer of 2009. set the scene for my story. I was rafting with friends. When you're on the river rafting for hours, you have to pull off to go to the bathroom. Well, that's exactly what we had just done. We had stopped in a clearing of a cove where the water was slower and kind of spooled in place. I started off walking along the small inlet beach made of stones, some tiny shells, and tattered driftwood. I made it to a spot far enough down that I was out of sight behind a few boulders, but still within earshot of the group. So here I am answering the call of nature when I hear the distinct sound of rocks rolling and cracking against each other, like when any person walks on a pile of rocks. It was coming from a few yards behind me, the opposite direction of the raft and the group. Not thinking one of the bros was trying to scare me, I continued to finish my call and set off to head back to the raft. But instead I dipped behind a set of trees on the other side of the boulders to hide and scare the bro that was trying to scare me. I'm crouched behind these trees in a pocket of foliage. I feel completely concealed. And there he was, walking out from behind the same boulders that I had just came from a minute ago. But that's when I realized it wasn't any of us. This person was not wearing any clothes, and they had hair all over their body. Their face was all fucked up. It looked half ape, half coyote-like. Its stance was so eerie as it stood there smelling the air, clearly tracing the scent of more than one human. It leaped up out of nowhere and on top of the boulders. Over the other side, I heard it dashing through the trees. I didn't dare move until I couldn't hear its pounding footsteps fade out of earshot. Then I ran like hell back to the raft. Everyone was laughing and eating a few snacks. I decided not to mention it for fear of ridicule / safety of the group. I just wanted to pack up and get the hell out of there. I spent 21 years in the army, all over the world and in 3 different atmospheres of war. I have barely slept since I've seen this thing. An enormous canine-type creature. I can still taste the fear in my throat and my own vomit. I am 6 foot tall, 250 pounds solid, and this thing dwarfed me. It had to been at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe 400 to 450 pounds of pure muscle. As a former college and semi-pro football player and power lifter, I know about people and about strength and muscularity. This was no normal creature. This was a creature that evolved somehow in that environment, and I can promise you, this is not something anyone wants to encounter twice. There ain't many things in this world that scare me. Put it simply, I've seen some shit in my days, but nothing prepared me for what I saw that night. I recall there was a search for a young man that had gotten stuck in a storm drain. I parked my cruiser at what I believe was the electric company storage yard. I About 5 minutes passed as I was standing there trying to find a way in for the boy before I hear a snorting, almost sniffing sounding from the other side of the tracks. I turned my light, and to this day I wish I hadn't. It had pointy ears, a long muzzle, and it looked me right in the face before it bolted into the timber. It was not a mask. There was no fucking way that was a person in a costume. Who would walk up on an armed man with police radio in full uniform and risk getting shot in the middle of the night, in the middle of the woods, during a missing person case? I remember it was so surreal. I know what's out in the dark at night now, and I know I have a reason to fear it. I don't patrol alone anymore, and I refuse to get out of the car if we're in the woods. I don't care if you think I'm a pussy. I have PTSD now because of what this creature's done to me. Anonymous. And yeah, that's gonna wrap up episode 3 for us. If you made it this far, put a like down below for me, and I'm still looking for some video suggestions, so if you got any ideas, put a comment in the comment section. And if you really enjoyed it, maybe hit that subscribe button. Appreciate it. If you do have any stories or artwork that you want to submit, I'll put the email up right here. And everybody else that's listened to me ramble on this far, I don't understand why. So have a good night.